The autumn sun cast long shadows across the dusty platform, as Liliana Lambert slumped to the wooden boards of the Clearwater Junction train depot, her vision swimming with black spots and the last of her strength finally giving out. The journey from Georgia had drained what little reserve she had left, and with no food for 2 days and barely any water, her body had simply surrendered. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" A deep voice cut through the haze of her consciousness, rough-edged but tinged with genuine concern. Liliana tried to focus on the face hovering above her strong jawline, weather-beaten skin, and eyes the color of a summer storm. A stranger's face, yet somehow kind in a world that had shown her precious little kindness. "Water," she managed to whisper, her throat as dry as the Wyoming Territory dust beneath her. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, whistled sharply to a boy loitering nearby. "Tommy, fetch some water quick now." He turned back to Liliana, carefully lifting her head and placing his rolled-up coat beneath it. "Just hold on, miss. Help's coming." As the cool liquid touched her parched lips moments later, Liliana drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin and onto her threadbare dress. The man supported her head with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Thank you," she murmured, her vision beginning to clear. She could see him better now, a cowboy in his late 20s, his dark hair partially covered by a well-worn hat, stubble shadowing his strong jaw. His clothes were dusty but of good quality, marking him as a working man of some means. "Name's Vincent Ward," he said, studying her with intelligent gray eyes. "Where are you headed all alone, miss, if you don't mind my asking?" Liliana hesitated, years of caution making her wary of sharing too much, but something in Vincent's steady gaze made her answer truthfully. "Denver. I have a cousin there. I need to reach Denver." Vincent glanced at the station master, who was eyeing them with suspicion from the ticket office. "And your ticket?" Her eyes filled with tears of shame and frustration. I had enough for passage to here. I thought I could find work, earn the rest, but—" She gestured weakly at herself, the reality of her situation painfully obvious. Vincent's gaze moved past her to the southbound tracks, then back to the tattered carpetbag beside her, her only possession in the world. His expression shifted, something resolute settling over his features. "Wait here," he said, rising to his full height. "Rest a spell." Liliana watched as he strode toward the ticket office, his spurs jingling with each confident step. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw him pull out a leather wallet and count out bills. The station master's demeanor changed instantly, from suspicious to accommodating. Vincent pointed in her direction, and the man nodded, stamping something and handing it over. When Vincent returned, he was holding a ticket. "Denver," he said simply, placing it in her trembling hand. "Train leaves at 4. That's about 3 hours from now. Gives you time to rest and get something to eat." Liliana stared at the ticket, then up at the stranger who had just spent more money on her than anyone had in years. "I can't accept this. I can't repay you." Vincent's mouth quirked up slightly at one corner. "Not asking for repayment, miss. Just promising you'll reach freedom, whatever you're running from." There was understanding in his eyes, the kind that comes only from someone who recognizes another soul's desperate flight. "How did you know I was running?" she whispered. "Folks don't collapse at train depots in the middle of nowhere unless they're running toward something mighty important or away from something worse." He offered his hand. "Can you stand? There's a decent eating house across the street. My treat." The year was 1878, and for Liliana Lambert, 22 years old and fleeing a nightmare in Georgia, freedom suddenly had a price, and a handsome cowboy had just paid it. Vincent guided her across the dusty street to Maggie's Eating House, a simple establishment with clean tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread. He settled her at a corner table, ordered stew, bread, and coffee without consulting her, and then sat watching her with quiet attention as she slowly regained her strength. "Why are you helping me?" Liliana finally asked, her spoon pausing midway to her mouth. Vincent considered this, rolling his coffee cup between his palms. "My ma always said kindness costs nothing but means everything. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've got business in Denver myself. Heading there tomorrow. Figured sending you ahead was the Christian thing to do." Liliana studied him, trying to discern his true motives. Men in her experience always wanted something. "What business?" "Cattle business. I've got a small spread about 20 miles from here, taking some prime stock to the Denver market," he shrugged. "Nothing exciting." As they talked, Liliana gradually revealed pieces of her story, orphaned at 16, taken in by a distant uncle whose house had become a prison, especially after the war had left him bitter and violent. She didn't share the worst details, but Vincent seemed to read between the lines, his jaw tightening at what remained unspoken. "Your cousin in Denver?" he asked carefully. "They're expecting you." Liliana lowered her eyes. "Not exactly. We exchanged letters years ago. She said if I ever needed sanctuary." Vincent nodded slowly. "Well, Denver's a big place. If your cousin doesn't pan out, there's decent work for a young woman with proper manners. You can read and write." "Yes," she replied, surprised by the question. "My mother insisted before she passed. I even taught at a small school for a while." "That's valuable out here," Vincent said approvingly. "West needs educated folks, teachers especially." By the time they returned to the depot, color had returned to Liliana's cheeks and she could walk without assistance. Vincent saw her settled on a bench, brought her a newspaper, and then excused himself to check on something. When the train whistle sounded at 3:45, he reappeared carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "For the journey," he said, handing her the package. "Some food, a little money for when you reach Denver, and my address should you need anything." Liliana clutched the package, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you." "Live free," Vincent said simply. "That's thanks enough." As the train pulled into the station, he helped her aboard, ensuring she had a proper seat. Standing by her window, he tipped his hat. "Good journey to you, Miss Lambert. Will I see you again?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. A slow smile spread across his face. "I reckon Denver's not so big that paths can't cross again." As the train pulled away, Liliana pressed her hand to the glass, watching his figure grow smaller until it was just a speck against the vast Wyoming landscape. Something unfamiliar and warm bloomed in her chest, hope, perhaps, or something more complicated. In her lap, the brown package contained bread, cheese, dried beef, a small flask of water, $15 carefully folded, and a note with an address. Vincent Ward, Clearwater Creek Ranch. Below the address, he'd written, "Should freedom need a friend." The train journey to Denver lasted through the night. Liliana slept fitfully, her body still weak, but her mind calmer than it had been in months. She awoke to mountains on the horizon, and the bustling outskirts of a city growing larger by the minute. Denver in 1878 was a city in transformation. What had been a mining camp 2 decades earlier was now a growing metropolis, with brick buildings replacing wooden structures, streetcars beginning to appear, and the mingling of frontier ruggedness with Eastern sensibilities. Liliana stepped off the train, her legs wobbly but her resolve firm. She had her cousin's last known address, a boarding house on Lawrence Street, and Vincent's food had sustained her through the journey. With the $15 he'd given her, she could survive at least a week while searching for her cousin and work. The boarding house, when she found it, was respectable but modest. The proprietress, Mrs. Holloway, a thin woman with shrewd eyes, informed her that Sarah Lambert had indeed lived there 2 years ago. Married a shopkeeper and moved to San Francisco, Mrs. Holloway said, not unkindly. Left no forwarding address that I recall. Liliana's hope dimmed, but she squared her shoulders. Do you have a room available, just for a week, until I find employment? Mrs. Holloway named a rate that would consume half of Vincent's money. But I might know of some work, if you're respectable and can raid. The milliner on Blake Street needs an assistant, and the new school is short of teachers. By the end of her 3rd day in Denver, Liliana had secured a position at the milliner's shop. Not ideal work, but it paid enough to cover her room and food. Each night, she fell into exhausted sleep, but freedom, even with its hardships, tasted sweet after years of subjugation. On the 7th day, as she arranged hat displays in the shop window, a familiar figure caught her eye. Broad-shouldered, confident in his stride, though dressed more formally than when she'd last seen him. Vincent Ward stood across the street, seemingly in conversation with a banker type, but his eyes were on her. When their gazes met, he touched the brim of his hat in silent acknowledgement. That evening, as Liliana returned to her boarding house, Vincent was waiting on the porch, hat in hand. "Miss Lambert," he said, standing as she approached, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Ward," she replied, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. "You made it to Denver after all." "Cattle business went well," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "And I found myself wondering how a certain young lady was faring in a new city." Liliana smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Better than expected, thanks to your generosity. I found work at Miller's Millinery." "Not teaching, then?" She shook her head. "The school position required references I don't have, but I'm grateful for honest work." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad to hear it. I was wondering. That is, if you're not otherwise engaged, would you do me the honor of joining me for supper tomorrow evening? There's a decent restaurant near the hotel where I'm staying." The invitation surprised her. Men like Vincent Ward, solid, prosperous ranchers, didn't typically court women like her, without family or fortune. Yet there was nothing in his manner that suggested impropriety. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. Vincent's smile transformed his weathered face, making him appear younger, almost boyish. 6 o'clock. I could call for you here." And so began a courtship that defied Liliana's expectations. Vincent, she learned, was not merely a small-time rancher, but the owner of a growing cattle operation that supplied beef to military forts and Indian reservations across Wyoming and Colorado. He was in Denver not just to sell cattle, but to secure financing for expanding his herd. "Land's opening up," he explained over their second dinner together. "Government's pushing the tribes onto reservations, opening territory for grazing. Not that I agree with how they're treating the Indians," he added, surprising her with his candor. "But a man's got to look to the future in this country." Liliana found herself drawn to his straightforward manner and quiet strength. Unlike other men she'd known, Vincent listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and never made her feel less for being a woman alone in the world. "Why aren't you married?" she asked him one evening as they walked along Cherry Creek, the setting sun painting the water golden. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "Was engaged once, back in '71. Emily was her name. Cholera took her and most of her family in one awful week." His voice carried an old pain. "After that I headed west, built the ranch, kept busy." "I'm sorry," Liliana said softly, understanding loss all too well. "Life goes on," he replied, then looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sometimes it even gives you a second chance, if you're brave enough to take it." Over the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened toward winter, They grew closer. Vincent extended his stay in Denver, finding reasons to remain that had increasingly little to do with cattle and everything to do with the young woman who had collapsed at a train depot and somehow changed the course of his life. For Liliana, who had known only control and cruelty from men, Vincent's gentle courtship was a revelation. He brought her books, knowing her love of reading. He escorted her to church on Sundays and to the occasional theatrical performance. He respected her boundaries and never pushed for more than she was willing to give. But as November turned bitter cold, reality intruded on their idyll. "I have to return to the ranch," Vincent told her one evening as they sat in the parlor of her boarding house, the only privacy Mrs. Holloway's rules allowed them. "Winter's coming and there's work that won't wait." Liliana nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Their time together had been like a beautiful dream, but dreams, she knew all too well, always ended. "I understand," she said softly. "You've been away too long already." Vincent took her hand, his touch warm and certain. "Liliana, I'm not good with fancy words, but I need to ask you something important." He drew a deep breath. "Would you consider coming back to Wyoming with me, as my wife?" The question hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. "Vincent," she whispered, her heart racing. "Are you certain? You barely know me." "I know enough," he replied, his voice steady. "I know you're brave and strong even when you don't feel it. I know you're kind and smart and determined. I know that when I'm with you, I feel like the man I always wanted to be." He squeezed her hand. "But most of all, I know that I love you, Liliana Lambert. And if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret giving me your heart." Tears filled her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Vincent Ward." They were married 3 days later in a small church with only the minister, his wife, and Mrs. Holloway as witnesses. Liliana wore a new blue dress that Vincent had insisted on buying her, and he wore a proper suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. The journey back to Wyoming was vastly different from her first desperate flight. They traveled by train, then by Vincent's sturdy wagon for the final stretch to Clearwater Creek Ranch. As they crested the final hill and Liliana saw the ranch spread out below the solid main house, the bunkhouse, barns, and corrals, all nestled in a valley with mountains rising beyond, she felt a sense of homecoming she hadn't experienced since childhood. "It's not grand," Vincent said, watching her face anxiously. "But it's good land with good water. The house is sound, though it could use a woman's touch." Liliana turned to him, her heart full. "It's beautiful, Vincent. It's more than I ever dreamed of having." The ranch hands, 4 weathered cowboys who clearly respected their boss, welcomed her with shy deference. Mrs. Gunderson, the widow who cooked for the ranch, embraced her warmly, clearly relieved to have another woman on the property. Life as a rancher's wife was demanding but fulfilling. Liliana learned to manage a household, to preserve food for winter, to ride astride scandalous by Eastern standards, but practical for ranch life, and even to handle a rifle. Vincent never treated her as less than a partner, consulting her on business decisions and respecting her growing knowledge of ranch operations. Their love deepened with each passing season. Vincent's tenderness in private matched his strength in public, and Liliana blossomed under his devotion, shedding the last shadows of her past. When spring came, Vincent expanded the ranch house, adding rooms that puzzled Liliana until he explained. "For children," he said, holding her close as they stood in the empty space, "and for books. You mentioned wanting to teach again someday." Tears stung her eyes at his thoughtfulness. "I would love that, but there aren't enough children nearby for a proper school." "Not yet," Vincent agreed. "But the territory's growing." Families will come, and until then, you could teach the hands who want to learn. Rodriguez can barely write his name, and Thompson's always borrowing your books." By the following year, Liliana had indeed established a small school in one of the new rooms, teaching not only the ranch hands who wanted to improve their letters, but also children from neighboring homesteads and the nearby town. When their first child, a daughter they named Emily Rose, arrived in the summer of 1880, Liliana felt her happiness was complete. Yet the freedom Vincent had promised her that day at the train depot extended beyond personal happiness. As the territory moved toward statehood, Liliana became involved in the campaign for women's suffrage, writing letters to newspapers and hosting meetings at the ranch. Wyoming Territory had been the first to grant women the vote in 1869, and Liliana was determined to ensure that right remained when statehood came. Vincent supported her efforts, even when some neighbors raised eyebrows at his political wife. "Freedom means something different to everyone," he told a disapproving cattle baron at a territorial meeting. "For my wife, it means having a voice, and I'd no sooner silence her than I'd cut off my own right arm." 5 years after their marriage, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, their daughter playing nearby and Liliana heavy with their second child, Vincent turned to her with a smile. "You ever think about that day at the depot?" he asked. "How different things might have been if I'd taken another train, or if you'd collapsed a day earlier or later?" Liliana leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she once thought impossible. "I think fate brought us together, or Providence, perhaps." Vincent chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "Maybe so. Or maybe it was just dumb luck that the prettiest girl I ever saw happened to faint right in front of me." She elbowed him playfully. "I did not faint. I collapsed from exhaustion. There's a difference." "Either way," he said, his voice growing serious, "it was the luckiest day of my life." He placed his hand over her rounded belly, feeling their second child kick. "Did I keep my promise, Lily? Did you find your freedom?" Liliana turned her face to his, seeing in his weathered features the same kindness that had given her hope when she had none. "You gave me something better than freedom, Vincent Ward. You gave me a home." She leaned up to kiss him softly. "And if that's not freedom, I don't know what is." As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Liliana thought of how far she had come from that desperate young woman who collapsed at a train depot with nothing but a dream of escape. Vincent had paid her fare and promised her freedom, but in the end, he had given her so much more love, family, purpose, and a place to belong. Their story, like the West itself, was one of hardship transformed by hope, of strangers becoming family, of small kindnesses changing lives forever. And as darkness fell and Vincent lit the lamp in their window, guiding them home, Liliana knew with bone-deep certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginning, led exactly where they were meant to go.